So with that, all right. So thank you for reporting back. That was great. So it sounded like we had some good discussion. We're going to pick up with Exodus chapter 3, verses 1 through 10. And again, if somebody would read those to us, I would greatly appreciate that.
Excellent, Sarah.
I know.
It's fine. Oh.
Yeah, we didn't get everything yet. Yeah. Would you like me to read it, Pastor Jay?
Please, go ahead.
The one with now Moses, that's
Yep.
the one? Okay.
Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and Jebusites. Boy, I probably got some of those wrong. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go, I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt.
All right, thank you. So Moses fled out to the desert after he had a conflict with an Egyptian who was beating one of the Hebrew slaves. He kills this Egyptian man, and he flees out to the desert. He's been out there for quite a while, and then God appears to Moses as a burning bush, or from a burning bush. And God says to Moses, I've seen this, I've heard it, I'm concerned, I know what's going on, I've come down, I'm going to do something about it. By the way, has God ever sent you a talking plant to straighten you out?
No.
Anybody, has God ever done that? No? Good. Okay, you're doing better than Moses was. You're doing better than Moses. God says, I know what's going on. I'm going to do something about it. God is going to be on the side of these oppressed people. He's going to rescue them from the hands of their oppressors. And as I mentioned James Cone earlier, it's no wonder that this story and the whole Exodus story of how God rescues the Israelites from Egypt resonated with slaves and abolitionists before and during the American Civil War, and then with Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights leaders in the 50s and the 60s. But just like Martin Luther King, Abraham Lincoln, and the abolitionists, Moses had to do something. God tells him to go talk to the Pharaoh. And if we read the rest of Exodus chapter 3 and Exodus chapter 4, we would basically see Moses arguing with God, but eventually going back to Egypt to do what God called him to do. You know, in Lutheran theology, we often talk about there being two kingdoms. And often we talk about that as if there's the government or the nation that provides order, then there's the church that brings the gospel. But the really important distinction between two kingdoms is there's the kingdom of God and there's the kingdom of the devil, or the kingdom of evil. And what the Exodus story shows us is that God is on the side of the oppressed, the poor, the people who are hurting. God chose to free people from the conditions in which they were trapped. and he freed them from the power of evil in their lives. And then here God calls Moses to help set the people free. God uses people to work for the good of other people. So, I said we're going to talk about how these stories get picked up in the New Testament, how it applies to Jesus. Matthew is, in a lot of ways, the most Jewish of the Gospels. And Matthew is often very explicit about making references to the Old Testament. So I want to look at a reference in Matthew. If you'll turn that page with the scripture lessons over, you'll see Matthew 2, 13 through 16. Could somebody read that for us?
When they, the Magi, had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. "Get up," he said, "take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him." So he got up, took the child and his mother during the night, and left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod. And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I called my son." When Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious, and he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. So, in these few verses, there are a couple of references back to the Exodus story and to Moses. Because, like Moses, here Jesus is protected from a king who wants to kill all of the male Hebrew babies. And secondly, just like God called Moses to take the people out of Egypt into the promised land, here God, after sending Joseph and Mary and Jesus to Egypt, just like Moses and his people were in Egypt, God then brings Jesus out of Egypt and back to Israel. So this is a recurring theme through the Bible, where people keep going to Egypt and then getting brought back. It happens again and again and again. And in future weeks, we'll spend more time looking at New Testament passages to pick these up. But I want to talk about something a little bit different tonight, because this brings us to the idea that Jesus himself would have been seen as trying to bring what N.T. Wright calls a new Exodus. The first century people of Israel considered themselves oppressed by the Romans, just like the ancient Hebrews were oppressed by the Egyptians. And one way to describe their hope for being rescued from the Romans is to say that they were looking for someone like Moses to lead them out of oppression. And some of them would have talked about this in terms of being a new Exodus. So to make a little more sense out of this, and this is something we won't do every week, I promise, but I'm going to do some history and some maps, just to make this all make sense. So David becomes king sometime around 1000 BC. Here's what his kingdom would have looked like on a map at the time of his death. Notice how much bigger that is than what we think of as Israel today. David's son Solomon has a reputation of being very wise, but he's a good argument for fiscal restraint. He gets into financial trouble. It ends up costing him territory and making him raise taxes and do all sorts of things that people don't like. And the kingdom shrinks. And then after he dies, the kingdom splits, and you get the northern kingdom of Israel, which has broken away from the southern kingdom, which from that time on is called Judah. That happens about 900 BC. Then about 200 years later, the Assyrians, all of this green stuff on here is the Assyrian Empire. They conquer much of what we would call the Middle East today. They conquer the northern kingdom of Israel. And you'll notice down there, there's that, most of this is green. In the middle of all that green is this little yellow thing that says Judah. You see that? They don't manage to conquer Jerusalem. So there's this little carve out, but they've taken over most of the rest of that world. Then about 100 years later, about 600 BC, the Babylonian Empire conquers the Assyrians, and you notice this time they got Jerusalem. They conquered Jerusalem, and they take away the leadership of Judah, which is most of the inhabitants of Jerusalem. And they take them away in what is referred to as the Babylonian captivity or the exile. The people are taken as slaves to Babylon. Some of them escape to Egypt. You'll notice that Egypt is not taken over by Babylon, and some of them escape to Egypt. That's in about 600 BC. Then, in about 538, Persia comes along and conquers the Babylonians, and you see the size of their empire here. And when they conquer Babylon, they let the Jewish people, the Hebrews who were in Babylon, go home to Jerusalem if they want to go. And some of them do. Some of them actually stayed in Babylon, and there continues to be a Jewish or Hebrew community there. But the people who go back, they're really excited to get to go home, but they get there and it's not right. It's not what they expect. You know, they say you can't go home again. Well, it doesn't work out. If you
This is Jerusalem you're talking about?
yeah,
You go back to Jerusalem.
yeah, the people who go back to Jerusalem, it's just not right. If you'd like more detail on that, you could read the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. It doesn't work out like they wanted it to, and even though they're home, they're still subject to rule by the Persians. So they're not in charge. And over the next 400 or so years, there's a whole succession. Alexander the Great comes along. His empire falls apart relatively quickly because he dies young. The Hebrews end up being ruled by people called the Seleucids. You're familiar with the Hanukkah story? The Hanukkah story is about the people of Israel conquering the Seleucids and getting their country back and kicking the Seleucids out. But what happens, unfortunately, is that the people who led the revolution to throw out the Seleucids end up being corrupt. So now Israel has their own leadership in place, but it's corrupt leadership. And eventually the Roman Empire comes along, and you can see the Roman Empire basically controls everything all around the Mediterranean. And the result of all of this would have been that there would be no first century Jew who was a serious thinker who would have thought that all the promises and all the prophecies from Isaiah or Jeremiah or Ezekiel or Zechariah had come true, that they'd all been fulfilled. They don't think the pagans have been defeated. They don't think that Yahweh has really come back to Jerusalem and is really living in the temple and is really ruling the world. They don't think that their covenant was really renewed. They don't think that their sins, which could be summarized as not caring for the poor or worshiping other gods, they don't think those sins have actually been forgiven. Paganism triumphed. The pagans won. at the time of the Babylonian captivity. And the people are still waiting for their God, Yahweh, the Lord, to triumph over the pagans in a real historical and physical way. These are not people who are waiting to go to heaven when they die. They expect the day of the Lord to be an historical event where Israel and Israel's God triumph over their enemies, when God would act decisively in human history to defeat the people who are oppressing them. In short, first century Jews don't believe that the exile is really over. As far as they're concerned, they're still in Babylon or they're still in Egypt. They think they're still oppressed and in captivity. They're waiting to be rescued from the Romans, just like Moses rescued the people and led them out of Egypt. So one way to talk about this is to talk about it as a new Exodus, where God is going to act in Israel's history to defeat Israel's oppressors. And we're going to spend the next 5 weeks looking at some passages from the Exodus story, how Israel goes from slavery to the Promised Land, and seeing how those passages are then reflected in Jesus' ministry and in the Gospels. So we're going to see how Jesus would have been seen by his contemporaries as actually leading a new exodus and freeing people from slavery to the Romans. With that, that's what we're going to be doing for the next 5 weeks. I hope I didn't just scare you away with a whole bunch of maps and history.
No, not too bad.
Not too bad, all right. I'll take that. I'll take not too bad. And with that, let's do that second set of discussion questions. And we'll come back and again report back in about 10 or 15 minutes.